At around 3:30 in the morning on January 4, 2023, a neighbor in Enoch, Utah, heard what sounded like fireworks. There was no immediate reason to think otherwise. It was the middle of the night. The neighborhood was quiet. Nothing appeared unusual. But those sounds were gunshots. Inside one home, 8 members of the same family were already dead. 42-year-old Michael Haight had killed his wife, 40-year-old Tausha Haight, their 5 children, 17-year-old Macie, 12-year-old Briley, 7-year-old twins Sienna and Ammon, and 4-year-old Gavin. He had also killed Tausha's 78-year-old mother, Gail Earl. Michael then went downstairs to a basement room and killed himself. But the full picture would not become clear that morning. Investigators would eventually uncover records showing that the family had been dealing with allegations of abuse, growing conflict, and an increasingly serious breakdown inside the home. The warning signs had not appeared all at once. They had been building.
You do need help. I hope you can get it. I want you to.
I want it. I've told you.
I deserve to be treated so much better.
This is what we know. Michael and Tausha Haight had been married for about 20 years. They were raising 5 children in Enoch, a small community in southern Utah. To people outside the home, the family could appear stable. They were involved in their community. They were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Michael worked in the insurance business and was described by neighbors as friendly and helpful. One neighbor remembered meeting him after moving into the area. Michael introduced himself and asked whether the new neighbor had children. His own children soon became friends with them. There was nothing about that introduction that revealed what investigators would later find inside the family's history. By 2020, however, police had already been called to the Haight home. The allegations involved Michael and his oldest daughter, Macie. According to police records, Macie described incidents in which her father had allegedly become physically aggressive toward her. She also described behavior she considered emotionally abusive. She said Michael had grabbed or physically assaulted her during confrontations. There were also allegations involving Tausha. She described controlling behavior and said Michael had taken her phone in an effort to prevent her from leaving the house. Tausha also reportedly told police that Michael would speak negatively about her. No criminal charges were filed against him over those allegations. Tausha reportedly hoped the investigation would serve as a wake-up call. It did not end the problems inside the home, and almost 3 years later, another set of concerns would bring authorities back into the family's life. In December 2022, Utah's Division of Child and Family Services received information connected to earlier allegations involving Macie. Then, on December 12, 12-year-old Briley reportedly sent a message to a friend expressing concern about her father's behavior. She wanted someone to make sure she was safe. That message came only days before a DCFS caseworker visited the Haight home. On December 19, the caseworker met with Tausha. During that visit, Tausha described a recent incident involving 7-year-old Ammon. According to her account, Michael had become angry when Ammon was sick and did not want to prepare for school. Tausha said Michael threw the child onto the floor before leaving for work. The caseworker was expected to follow up, but the family would not make it to that follow-up, because by then, Tausha had made a decision. She was preparing to leave her marriage. On December 21, she and her attorney prepared divorce papers. For Tausha, the decision was significant. Later interviews indicated that she was relieved about the divorce. Some of the children also appeared to welcome the possibility that Michael would no longer be living in the home. But at almost the same time, another major part of Michael's life had collapsed. He had lost his job at Allstate. According to investigators, Michael told a friend that he had been terminated for a policy violation and would not receive his expected Christmas bonus. People interviewed by police also described him as deeply concerned about his reputation and how others viewed him. Now 2 things were changing at once. His marriage was ending, and his employment was gone. The family problems were no longer only allegations recorded years earlier. They were becoming immediate. On December 27th, Michael was served with the divorce papers. According to people later interviewed by investigators, his reaction was unusual. He did not immediately explode, but afterward he told Tausha that she needed to leave the house when he returned. He wanted her to leave the children there. Tausha was concerned enough to make other arrangements. She took the children to her mother's home in Laverken. Then Michael appeared there unexpectedly. He attempted to persuade Tausha to leave with him for a drive. She refused. Friends later told investigators that Tausha had said she had a terrible feeling and did not want to go anywhere alone with him. She eventually shut the door and told him to leave. The family later returned home, but the marriage was no longer simply in trouble. The separation was happening, and Michael was losing control over the situation. There was another revealing moment days later. At church the following Sunday, Tausha prevented Michael from sitting with her and the children. Investigators would later hear that Michael was angry because he believed the separation was damaging his public image. That concern would become increasingly important, because while people around the family were seeing a marriage breaking apart, Michael was beginning to make searches that investigators would later examine closely. And those searches would reveal that something much more serious was developing. By the end of December, the question was no longer simply whether the marriage could survive. The question was what Michael would do when it did not. The final week of 2022 brought more warning signs. Michael Haight's marriage was ending. His employment was gone. His relationship with his children had deteriorated, and investigators would later discover that he had begun searching the internet for information about gunshots. On December 30th, Michael searched questions about how loud a gunshot was. He searched what a gunshot sounded like. He also searched whether neighbors would recognize a gunshot at night. One search concerned whether a neighbor could hear a gunshot from inside a garage. Those searches became some of the most significant pieces of evidence investigators found. At that point, the divorce was already underway. Tausha had made it clear that she intended to leave. Michael had already been served with the divorce papers, and people around the family had begun noticing how serious the situation had become. But there was still another development. On January 2, Tausha told her attorney that Michael had removed several firearms from the house. One of them was a handgun that she normally kept in her nightstand. That detail mattered because the family was still living together. The divorce had not yet separated them physically. The children were still in the home, and firearms were being moved. 2 days later, the family would be dead. But before that happened, Michael spent January 3 carrying out a series of actions that investigators later viewed as preparations. He left his secretary's paycheck on his desk. He also left paperwork connected to his living trust. These were ordinary documents. Under different circumstances, they might have meant nothing, but investigators were reconstructing the final day of a man who would soon kill his entire family. The documents became part of that reconstruction. Michael also recorded a video directed toward Tausha. In it, he asked her to work things out. He said he felt that she was backing me into a corner. The phrase would later receive considerable attention, because by then, Michael's circumstances were narrowing. His wife wanted a divorce. His children were reportedly unhappy with his behavior. He had lost his job, and his concern about how the divorce affected his reputation had already been reported to investigators. Yet there was no trial. There would be no opportunity for a jury to hear Michael explain himself. He would die the following morning. That meant investigators had to reconstruct his state of mind from what he had done and what he had left behind.
So aggressively to move out of here too, and not let the system play out, and why you're feeling like you have to get some motion to remove me from here.
Our kids have mentioned, especially our older two, have mentioned that when you're here, it is more tense.
On January 3rd, Michael also sent Tausha messages asking to talk. She did not respond. A friend contacted him and asked whether he needed anything. Michael replied that he had his hands full. It was the last full day of his life. And it was the last full day of the lives of 7 other people inside that house. The family went into the night. At some point, Michael remained awake while the rest of the household eventually went to sleep. The exact sequence inside the house before the shootings cannot be completely reconstructed. Investigators could determine where the victims were found. They could examine the physical evidence. They could examine Michael's searches, messages, documents, and recorded video. But there was no surviving witness inside the home to explain exactly what happened in those final moments. Then, at approximately 3:30 a.m. on January 4, a neighbor heard what sounded like fireworks. There were no fireworks. The sounds were gunshots. Inside the house, Michael used a firearm to kill his wife, his 5 children, and his mother-in-law. Most of the victims were found in bedrooms. Several appeared to have been killed while in bed. Tausha and Gail were found in the master bedroom. The children were found in their individual bedrooms. Macie was 17, Briley was 12. The twins, Sienna and Ammon, were 7. Gavin was 4. There were no adults left alive in the house who could explain what had happened. Michael then went downstairs. He entered a basement room containing exercise equipment. There, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A handgun was found near him. Investigators also found a handwritten suicide note. The contents of that note would become important. It did not accept responsibility for the deaths. Instead, Michael blamed his family and portrayed himself as the victim of the circumstances. That would become one of the clearest indications of how investigators understood the killings. But at the time, none of that was known outside the house. The neighborhood was still waking up. The family had not yet been discovered, and the first indication that something was wrong came from an appointment Tausha was supposed to attend that morning. She never arrived. Someone who had been expecting her became concerned. Authorities were contacted. A welfare check was requested. Police went to the Haight home. At first, there was no response. No one came to the door. No one answered from inside. The officers could not immediately determine what had happened. Then neighbors entered the home. One of them discovered a body. Police were contacted again. Officers entered the residence. What they found confirmed that this was not a missing person case. 8 people were dead. The investigation had now begun, and investigators were facing a question that would define the case for years afterward. How had a family already known to police and child welfare authorities reached this point without the danger being stopped? That question would lead investigators back through the previous years, and especially through the final weeks, when the warnings had become harder to ignore. Once investigators entered the Haight home, the case changed immediately. There was no longer any question about whether the family had been harmed. 8 people were dead. Michael Haight had killed 7 members of his family before killing himself. Because Michael was also dead, investigators would never have the opportunity to question him about the killings. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no courtroom testimony from the person responsible. Instead, investigators had to reconstruct the events from records, interviews, digital evidence, physical evidence, and the history of the family. The first task was identifying the victims and documenting where they had been found. Tausha and her mother, Gail Earl, were found in the master bedroom. The children were found in their individual bedrooms. Michael was found downstairs in a basement room containing exercise equipment. The physical evidence established the basic sequence. Michael had moved through the home, killing his family members before going downstairs and taking his own life. But the evidence could not answer the most difficult question: why? That question became more complicated when investigators went back through the family's history. The problems had not begun in January 2023. There had already been allegations of physical and emotional abuse involving Michael and Macie in 2020. Police records documented concerns about Michael's behavior toward his daughter. Tausha had also described controlling behavior, yet no criminal charges were filed. The family remained together. Years passed. Then the concerns returned. In December 2022, DCFS became involved again. Briley had reportedly expressed concern about her father's behavior. Tausha had described the incident involving Ammon, and a caseworker had visited the home on December 19. The investigation was still incomplete when the family was killed. That timing became one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Authorities had received information about possible abuse only weeks before the murders. The family had already been dealing with conflict for years, and Tausha was now taking concrete steps to end the marriage. For her, the divorce was not simply a disagreement. She had prepared the paperwork with her attorney. She had expressed relief about leaving, and when Michael appeared unexpectedly at her mother's home after she had taken the children there, she refused to go with him. Friends later told investigators that she had been afraid to be alone with him. Those details became particularly significant when viewed alongside what Michael had been searching for online. On December 30th, he searched about gunshots. Not simply firearms, gunshots. He wanted to know how loud they were, what they sounded like, whether neighbors would hear them at night, and whether a gunshot could be heard from inside a garage. The searches did not prove exactly what Michael intended at that moment, but investigators later considered them alongside everything else that happened in the days that followed. Then came January 2. Tausha told her attorney that Michael had removed firearms from the house. The handgun she normally kept in her nightstand was among them. 2 days remained. On January 3rd, Michael's behavior became even more difficult to interpret as ordinary. He left his secretary's paycheck on his desk. He left his living trust paperwork there as well. He recorded the video directed toward Tausha. He said he wanted to work things out. He said he felt that she was backing him into a corner, and he sent messages asking her to talk. She did not respond. A friend reached out to him. Michael said he had his hands full. There was no message announcing what he intended to do. There was no surviving statement explaining the plan. Instead, investigators were left with a collection of actions that only became fully significant after the murders. That is one of the difficulties in reconstructing family violence. Individual warning signs can appear disconnected when they happen. Their meaning becomes clearer only after the outcome is known. By the morning of January 4, those signs had converged. The family was inside the house. Michael had access to firearms, and sometime around 3:30 a.m., the neighbor heard the sounds that would later be identified as gunfire. The killings were over before anyone outside the home understood what was happening. The discovery came later that morning. Tausha had been expected at an appointment. She did not appear. Concern led to the welfare check. Police arrived. There was initially no response. Then a neighbor entered. The discovery of one body led to the discovery of the others. The house contained the remains of an entire family. 7 victims, 1 perpetrator. The ages alone showed the scale of the loss. Gail Earl was 78. Tausha was 40. Macie was 17. Briley was 12. Sienna and Ammon were 7. Gavin was 4. The oldest child was preparing for adulthood. The youngest was still 4 years old. And none of them survived the night. The investigation then turned toward Michael's suicide note. Its significance was not that it explained everything. It did not. Instead, the note reflected Michael's attempt to frame what had happened from his own perspective. He blamed his family. He presented himself as the victim. That was consistent with investigators' broader findings about his behavior and his concern over the divorce and his public image. But investigators could not establish a single sentence that explained the murders. There was no courtroom finding of motive. There could not be one. Michael had died before he could ever stand trial, so the conclusion had to be based on the accumulated evidence. His marriage was ending. His employment had ended. His relationship with his children had deteriorated. There had been previous allegations of abuse. A new child welfare investigation was underway. Tausha had taken legal steps to leave, and in the final days, Michael had searched about gunshots and moved firearms from the home. The evidence suggested that the divorce was a major trigger, but investigators could not honestly reduce the murders to one event. The pattern was older than the divorce. The final weeks simply brought the existing conflict to its most dangerous point. And while investigators were reconstructing what happened inside the Haight home, the community of Enoch was beginning to understand that 7 innocent people had been killed. Their names would soon be remembered separately from the man who killed them, and that distinction mattered, because the next question was no longer only why Michael Haight had done it, it was what would remain of the family he had destroyed. In the days after the killings, the investigation continued to focus on what had happened inside the Haight home. But for the people who knew the family, the case was no longer simply an investigation. 7 people had been taken from their community. Michael Haight was responsible for their deaths. He had also died that same morning. There would be no trial and no sentencing. There would be no opportunity for the victim's relatives to confront him in court or hear a complete explanation from him. The people left behind had to live with the evidence and the questions. Among the most difficult questions was whether the warning signs had been recognized early enough. Police had previously responded to allegations involving Michael and Macie. Tausha had described controlling behavior. In December 2022, DCFS had received new information. Briley had reportedly expressed concern about her safety. Tausha had described the incident involving Ammon, A caseworker had visited the home, and then Tausha had begun the process of ending the marriage. The DCFS investigation had not been completed when Michael killed the family. That sequence inevitably raised questions about whether more could have been done. But the case did not provide an easy answer. The authorities had records of allegations. They had made contact with the family. They had begun an investigation. What could have prevented January 4th remained a painful question without a definitive answer. The community instead turned its attention toward the people who had died. The funeral services were attended by hundreds of people. Nearly 850 people attended services for Gail Earl, Tausha, and the 5 children. They were buried together at Laverton City Cemetery. The focus was on who they had been, not on the man who killed them. Macie was remembered as a teenager who was preparing to graduate and attend Southern Utah University. She was 17 years old. Her future was approaching. Briley was remembered for her love of reading and music. She was 12. Ammon was remembered for his love of trains and Legos. He was 7. His twin sister, Sienna, was remembered for her personality and her striking blue eyes. She was also 7. Gavin, the youngest, was 4. He was remembered as affectionate and mischievous. Their mother, Tausha, was remembered by her siblings as a loving and dedicated mother. Her mother, Gail Earl, was remembered as a devoted mother and grandmother. Those descriptions became important because the circumstances of their deaths could easily have overshadowed their lives. They were not simply names in a police report. They were a mother, 5 children, and a grandmother. They had families of their own who had to continue living after January 4. The case also left Enoch confronting a difficult reality. The family had appeared ordinary to many people who knew them casually. Michael had been described as friendly. The children had friendships in the neighborhood. The family participated in their community and religious life, but the records showed that life inside the home had been more complicated. There had been allegations of physical aggression. There had been allegations of emotional abuse. There had been concerns about controlling behavior. There had been children expressing fear and frustration, and in the final weeks, Tausha had reached the point where she wanted to leave. None of those facts alone explains the murders, but together they provide the context investigators used to understand how the family reached its final days. The most significant factor appeared to be control. Tausha was leaving. The children were no longer simply accepting the situation. Michael had lost his job, and he was reportedly concerned about how the divorce affected his reputation. His searches about gunshots came only days before the killings. His firearms were moved shortly before them. His final video described himself as being backed into a corner. Then came the shooting. The evidence does not establish that the divorce alone caused the murders. That conclusion would be too simple. The documented history shows a much longer pattern of conflict and alleged abuse. The divorce appears to have become a major trigger within that larger pattern. But because Michael died immediately after the killings, the investigation could never test his explanation in court. His suicide note blamed others. It did not provide accountability for the 7 people he killed. That left investigators and the victims' families to reconstruct the motive from everything that remained. Police reports, witness interviews, messages, internet searches, legal documents, the DCFS records, and the physical evidence inside the home. Together, those pieces showed a family whose problems had become increasingly serious in the weeks before January 4. They also showed that some of those problems had been visible years earlier. The tragedy, therefore, did not begin at 3:30 in the morning. That was simply when the violence reached its final point. The deeper history involved years of conflict, allegations of abuse, attempts to intervene, and a marriage that eventually reached the point of divorce. For the people who survived the family, there was no complete explanation waiting at the end of the investigation. There was only evidence, and 7 lives that could not be restored. Michael Haight was 42 when he died. Tausha was 40. Gail was 78. Macie was 17. Briley was 12. Sienna and Ammon were 7. Gavin was 4. 7 of them were victims. 1 was the perpetrator. And because the perpetrator also died, the final understanding of the case had to come from the record he left behind. The records showed warning signs. They showed a marriage ending. They showed a family under increasing strain. They showed a man whose job, marriage, and relationship with his children were deteriorating. They showed searches about gunshots. They showed firearms being removed. And they showed a final mourning when the entire family was killed inside their home. The community of Enoch was left with the consequences. The families of the victims were left with the loss. And the unanswered questions remained part of the case, not because the facts were unknown, but because sometimes the facts can establish what happened without ever providing a complete explanation for why a person chose to do it. On January 4, 2023, Michael Haight killed 7 members of his family and then killed himself. The investigation ended with him. The loss did not. The Haight family was remembered together in death, but each victim had lived a separate life, with separate relationships, interests, and plans. Those lives were cut short inside a home where authorities had already received warnings. That is what makes the case so difficult to reduce to a single explanation. It was not simply the story of one night. It was the documented history of a family under strain, a woman attempting to leave, children expressing concerns, authorities trying to assess those concerns, and a man whose circumstances were deteriorating before the violence began. The final answer to every question may never exist. Michael Haight made sure of that when he took his own life. But the record preserves enough to establish what happened. 8 people entered the final hours of January 3, 2023. Only one of them was responsible for what followed. By the morning of January 4th, 7 innocent people were dead. And the family they left behind was forced to remember them, not for how they died, but for who they had been.